Hello and welcome to this video. We are studying Koine Greek, the language of the New Testament, and today we are looking at the aorist tense. This video is going to give an overview of the aorist in its basic forms, what the aorist means, what it conveys, how to translate it, and look through some of the basic principles for how aorist tense is used and where it's used. So let's start by looking at what the aorist tense is. The aorist tense is a past tense that indicates a once-off action in the verb. Sometimes the aorist is used in the context of a present tense verb to indicate singularity in the verb action, so it indicates something has only happened once. But that would be alongside the present tense in a way that you'll already know that it is in the present. Most of the time, the aorist is used as a once-off past tense. For this video, I'm just going to go over the basic principles and then expand upon this later. There are various words that don't really behave with the standard rules. There's some extra things to learn, some further and more complex information that would probably only be useful to you if you're going to take this to academic study. I'm going to come back to those in levels 3 and 4 for now. I'll just take an overview of the basic principles, looking at the indicative form in the active voice. In the New Testament, we have 5 moods. Indicative, the basic form of verbs. Subjunctive, where you reach a junction in the sentence, if you like, where it's saying something is going to happen in order that something can happen. An imperative, which is a command, an instruction to do something. The infinitive, which is a basic form of the word without an inflection about person, for example. So it would be to read, the verb to learn, the verb to hear. Participles usually translated into English as ing words, and we'll come back to those later. But for now, you should remember that the aorist is the only tense that's going to exist in all moods and all voices. Only the aorist and the present tense are in these 5 moods in the New Testament. You can sometimes find these moods in other tenses in ancient Greek and other Koine Greek documents, but not in the New Testament. So that does limit how much we've got to learn. Do have a look back at the video on principles of the language if you need to be reminded about what moods and voices mean. But also, I'll point out here that the aorist tense, as well as being in all 5 moods, is in all 3 voices. So they can be active verbs, where the subject is doing the verb. The middle voice, usually used for coming and going, either in physical motion to, from a place, in, out of a place, a building, or a motion in thought or belief or something like that. And passive voice is used where the subject of the verb is receiving from, positively or negatively, or in some way benefiting from the action of that verb. For example, he heard, or where it says Pontius Pilate became afraid, that's a passive, for example. With the aorist and future tenses, there are a different set of endings in the passive voice. Whereas in present, imperfect and perfect voices, we are going to see the same endings for middle and passive. So you have to work out whether it's middle or passive by looking at the context, which is called the syntax, or as well as the morphology, the actual shape of that word. And look up maybe in a lexicon, you can look up what the word actually is and how it is used to understand that. But the aorist and the future both have separate passive voices, so we know exactly when they are passive. And the idea of middle and passive voice are not always very easy to convey in modern English, and we've somewhat lost this concept. But that's good for us studying New Testament Greek, because it means that there's a little bit of extra information that we can draw out that isn't always obvious in an English translation. So here are a few important things to know about the aorist. Firstly, it is very commonly used. much more so than you get in standard English. And you will see throughout all the books of the New Testament the aorist being used, and as I said, it is across the 5 different moods and across the 3 different voices, and is one of the most common verb forms we're going to find. Secondly, and this is a biggie, the aorist has 2 distinct forms. They mean exactly the same thing, but they have a different set of rules governing them. They look different. The morphology is different. That means that the shape is different. The first aorist brings us the standard aorist forms with aorist endings on the word and a thematic alpha within that ending. Whereas the second aorist has endings that look more like the imperfect, and instead of varying the ending from the imperfect, you vary the stem. So it will have a second aorist stem, and that stem may look completely different. It usually shortens the word, and it can look completely different and not even have any of the same letters in common as its present tense form. For now, just be aware that there is a second aorist tense, but I'm going to come back to that and do a separate video on the second aorist. Remember, they mean the same thing. Thirdly, the aorist indicative has what is known as an undefined aspect. This tells us that a verb is once off in action, but it doesn't say anything more about how it continues or what is progressing from that. In the present tense, the verb is always continuous. And when we look at subjunctives and infinitives, participles and imperatives, we will see that there are differences in the aspect of the verb, because those by their very nature are talking about things happening in order that something happens, or an instruction to do something. So they're different. But in the indicative mood, the aspect is undefined. For this reason, when the New Testament writers wrote about the present tense and they wanted to give off a clear singular nature of a present tense word, they do occasionally use the aorist in the present tense, but usually the present tense is continuous and or progressive. Like the other past tense verbs in the indicative, the aorist adds an epsilon at the beginning of the verb. This means that most of them will appear with an epsilon, but where that epsilon joins onto another vowel, it will elongate it, and if it joins an elongated vowel, they will stay the same. I'll come back in a sec to the rules about this, but remember, an epsilon augment gets added for aorist indicatives across all their voices. The aorist tense also has a sigma augment, like in the future. So the imperfect has an epsilon, the future has a sigma at the end of the stem and the beginning of the ending, whereas the aorist has both. And in the first aorist, it also has that thematic alpha. You might wonder why, therefore, we are able to distinguish between the imperfect and second aorist if they both have epsilon augments, neither have the sigma augment, and they both have imperfect endings. We do that because the stem is different and the second aorist has its own set of stems, just to remind you of that. This is actually something that we experience in English as well, where common verb behavior, where we would normally just add ed to a word to put it into a past tense as a once-off action. There are a number of English words that behave irregularly. You wouldn't say that the past tense of the verb to teach is teached, you'd say taught, and the past tense of the verb to catch is caught, not catched. And there are many examples of various languages where this happens, and we'll get certain verbs that don't behave by the standard rules. Also, the verb endings, 5 out of 6 times, begin with and alpha. This is called the thematic alpha. It comes after that sigma augment. It doesn't occur actually in the third person singular with he, she or it, but in all other cases we'll get it with the first and second person singular and with the first, second and third person plural. And we'll also see it in the middle and passive voices. In the passive it's elongated and we get a theta eta sound. Check out the separate video on aorist, middle and passive. And the last point, as I've said, remember it can look completely different. This is the second aorist this happens with. The group of second aorists basically came about because of regional differences in Greek. Greek used to be tribal in its makeup, with different regions having very distinctively different languages. And it was sometimes said that somebody from one tribe couldn't actually even understand somebody from another. So an Athenian, for example, might struggle to understand a Spartan. But Alexander the Great united these languages into one united language, Koine Greek. And in so doing, a lot of these regional differences were kind of rubbed out, but not all of them. Some of them have remained in the language. Some of them were pretty irregular verbs, but there's so much regularity about them. They have a consistent rule that they're kind of a fairly irregular, if that makes sense. They've gained their own set of rules as to how they are governed. There aren't very many second aorist verbs in the New Testament, but some of them are actually really common words, and so we will see the second aorist quite often, including in the examples that I've used from John's Gospel. So we get the sigma alpha at the beginning of the verb ending. That begins the verb ending and fits onto the end of the stem, and this is sometimes also called a marker, the marker of the first aorist. So for the active voice verbs in the first aorist, we have this marker, except in the third person singular, as I said. But for the second aorist, there isn't this marker, just the difference in the stem. We will see this in other moods as well, and we will see it in the middle voice. As I said, in the passive voice, it's elongated into a long A sound with an eta, and there's a theta before it, a thay sound. So be used to the sound of sa as a sign that there's an aorist, and get used to the sound of the thay to indicate a passive voice verb, either future or aorist intense. This is one of the reasons why I advocate having a go at saying the language out loud when you're learning it. Read it with other people, read it out loud to yourself, because your brain will start to pick up on that different sound, help you to remember things more effectively and help you to identify the aorist and the different voices more quickly. So giving an inflection to a verb is about communicating the characteristics of it. If we want to give an inflection as to the tense, we're going to add either an epsilon or sigma augment or both, and the ending gives the inflection about person and number. So using luo as a very basic word meaning to loose, to untie, in the first person singular we would have luo. In the future, I will untie, it would become luso. In the imperfect, which would be I was untying, eluon, because it's gained the epsilon augment. And then the aorist, which might be translated as I untied or I set free, you would have elusa, gaining both the epsilon augment and the sigma, and then the thematic alpha. Let's take a look also at another example that begins with a vowel, the verb to hear. Akuo, I hear. Akuso, I will hear. And then because the epsilon is joining on to a vowel that elongates it, we get an eta. So akuon, I was hearing. And akusa for I heard. using again the example of luo, if we look at the singular and plural forms, we would have elusa, elusas for you singular, and elusen for he, she, or it. And that nu at the end is going to be used to avoid elision, where there's the next word begins with a vowel. A nu is used so you don't get two vowels next to each other. Then for first person plural, elusamen, elusata for you plural, and elusan for they, third person plural. So we've looked so far at these four different tenses: present, future, imperfect and aorist. We're then going to add the perfect, and I'll mention briefly also the pluperfect when we do that. Pluperfect's not used that many times in the New Testament. But you can see here there's a bit of commonality in the way that these verbs end and the rules to which they are governed. In their basic and simple forms, the aorist adds an epsilon and a sigma augment and begins the verb ending with a thematic alpha. So here you can see a comparison of the different persons and the different tenses. Some of you might still be learning the alphabet somewhat, so I've popped in here the transliteration of those. Transliteration means basically swapping the Greek letters for English ones, whereas a phonetic pronunciation is where I basically spell out what it sounds like. This is just a transliteration where I've just swapped the letters around. Remember that omega, which looks like a curly W, is a long O sound, and an omicron, which just looks like the English O, is a short O sound. Alpha is a short A sound, and eta would be a long A sound if that joins onto an epsilon or alpha at the beginning of a word and creates a long vowel. That's where you get the A sound. At this point you might want to hit the pause button so you could spend some time just having a little look, but otherwise I will move on. If you need some extra time, hit pause now. So here are the rules for when you are adding an epsilon onto a vowel at the beginning of the word. If you add it to an alpha or an epsilon, it's elongated into the long vowel sound A, the eta. And this is why it's important to learn the difference between short and long sounds. Apart from how they actually sound when we say the word, there's different rules into how we change them for the imperfect and aorist tenses. Omicron, the short O sound, is also lengthened into an O sound, omega. Eta, iota, upsilon and omega will all stay the same. So usually a short vowel becomes a long one and a long one stays the same. The only exception to that rule really is iota. It's a short I sound, or y if it's got a hard breathing on it, but that one actually stays the same. So let's just revise also the rules for adding the sigma to a word. This is something that we will have done in the future tense as well if you've watched that video so far, but just to go over those again. You might want to pause this to have a bit longer, but I'll just go over them quite quickly. If the stem ends with one of the labial consonants, those are the ones said from your lips, p, b and f, then it's going to become a psi, ps sound. If the stem ends with a palatal consonant, also sometimes called a velar consonant, which is said from the palate of your mouth, like k, g and k, chi, then it becomes ksai. Quite obviously you've got a k and then a s sound, so ksai. And if you're adding it to the lingual consonants, the ones that are said from the front of the mouth, just behind the lips, d, f and t, then the consonant drops out and is replaced by the sigma. Where there is only vowels in the stem ending, the sigma is added. Sometimes the vowel will be lengthened, and you might get a circumflex over it to show you that that sort of thing has happened. Also remember that doubling of sibilant sounding, S-sounding words, is avoided. So when adding a sigma to zeta, the zeta would drop off. Adding sigmas to other sigmas become psi. Again, pause it here if you want a little bit more time to look at those. But if you practice where in your mouth you say them, that will help you to understand and remember the rules for adding that sigma. So let's look over a few examples. We had the verb to hear, as I already mentioned. If we were going to have a second person plural example of that in the aorist active indicative, it would be acousata. So that comes from akuo. First letter is lengthened. We add the sigma, thematic alpha, and then the ata bit gives the inflection for second person plural. This word in its different forms is used 430 times in the Bible, the verb to hear, so that's a good one to learn, acousata. Another example, agagen, is from ago, the verb to carry, and this is a third person singular example. It is used 71 times in the Bible in all its forms, agagen. You might be familiar with the word agape, meaning love as an abstract concept. A verb to love, I love, is agapao. And if we put this into, for example, a second person singular aorist, we would get agapesas for an active indicative. So, you, plural, loved in the past. Aorist once off, you loved, agapesas. The verb to love is used 143 times in the New Testament. And then here's another one, the verb to grasp something or to understand it is lambano, or kata lambano, which has joined the preposition meaning with, according to, or alongside. It then becomes kata lambano, a compound word. If we were to have a third person singular aorist active indicative, that would become kata laben. Kata laben is used 15 times in the New Testament, but all forms of the verb lambano are 261 times that verb is used. So with the kata it's not so common, but lambano is one of the most common verbs. Now I've pointed this one out so you can see an example of what happens where you've got a compound word, a preposition, meaning something like towards or alongside or out of or from or above or something like that, goes on before the verb. We get words like that in English as well, but these compounds where you've got prepositions joining verbs in the New Testament are very common. In the past they would have been two separate words and they've got pushed in together, so that epsilon augment actually goes on at the beginning of the verb and after the preposition, so it's not before the kata bit, it goes on to the end of kata and has replaced the alpha in kata to become kater. Then you might also notice that rather than being lamban, the verb lambano has lost a couple of letters. It is a second aorist example, so it doesn't have the sigma and it's got a separate form of the stem. So instead of lamban, the stem is now just lab. And that's quite common for second aorists to significantly shorten the stem. Kata laben. And then for the last example here, I've got the verb to make or to do, poieo. An example of putting that into the aorist I've taken from Matthew 18, and it's got a question mark after it. It says, ti epoiesas. What did you do? You singular in this case. What did you do? Ti epoiesas. The verb poieo in all its forms is used 572 times in the New Testament. So again, one of the most common verbs that we will see. It's a first aorist, so it's going to behave like the normal rules. We've got that sas bit at the ending there, and the epsilon has been added at the beginning. In this case, for complex rules I won't go into, the eta has been added onto the epsilon due to an augmentation in that case. But we'll come back to those rules when we do this a little bit more in depth in levels 3 and 4. But just remember that can sometimes happen, that the last vowel sound will get elongated when you add an aorist ending onto it. So epoiesas, you make or do. Ti epoiesas with a question mark. What did you make? What did you do? So if you would like to do a little bit of practice with that, then look up the Aorist practice video on the Practice Plus playlist. They're the videos with the green theme background. And also, if you'd like to find out about the second aorist, look that up. That's a separate video for that. And the middle and passive voices, I've done a separate video for that as well. So that's something else that you might like to look for. If you'd like to be updated when new videos are added on this channel, then click subscribe. And also, if you want to like the channel, that helps with its ratings and helps it to get seen by other people. Or if you want to put any comments, ask any questions, then you can put that in the comments section below. Otherwise, thanks for coming along, thanks for watching, goodbye and God bless.